Acceptance test-driven development, acceptance test-driven design has its roots in a concept called test-driven development. And this came about in a methodology or an approach called extreme programming, which predates Agile. But the concept was so good that it has taken over pretty much the entire Agile and Lean philosophies in the world of development. We have maintained for years that if you don't understand a requirement, if you can't tell me how you're going to prove once the application is delivered that the requirement has been met or that the user story has been implemented properly, you don't understand the requirement, the user story, the feature, or whatever else it is. Well, we finally have figured out a way of eliminating the interpretation by, first off, developing test scenarios and using the test scenarios, then giving the test scenarios to the developers. Those become the requirements ultimately that they are going to develop for. Test-driven development started off by saying, if you tell me exactly what you're going to test, I will write the program that will meet your tests. And at the beginning, it was at the code level, so the developers would be looking for test scenarios that are very, very simplistic, and they basically would get the test, execute the test, then maintain or refactor the program, fix the application, so it would pass the tests, and then get a next test, and keep going in cycles until all of the test scenarios that the end user specified were passed, and at that point, they would maintain the application is done. This went basically in cycles in the coding area. Lo and behold, like many things, we identified that this is a phenomenally effective technique for communicating really at the lowest level of detail, at the level of detail that developers need the requirements. We've basically elevated the concept one whole stage to where it is now called acceptance test-driven development or behavior-driven development. Those two terms are pretty much interchangeable. And what we're ultimately recognizing is we're going to start off by having a user story, a feature, a requirement, or whatever else it is. And then we are going to think about, okay, what are the tests that I would have to execute to prove that this user story or this feature isn't currently there? Give the user story, the test scenarios to the developers and have them take those test scenarios, possibly break them down into more detail and go through their entire cycle of testing. And ultimately, once they have proven that it passes all of their tests, it comes back to us to now execute our test scenarios that we defined and gave them and make sure that it really does what it passes all of these test scenarios. And in that case, we are then going to integrate that code into the application as a whole. And by doing that, we're actually setting the stage for a concept called continuous delivery, which is really the holy grail of information technology. Meaning, it's not going to be that you have to every few months implement a new release and you go through a bunch of changes all at once. Continuous delivery basically says, we're going to be delivering changes, we're going to be maintaining the software on the go. It's not, if something comes up, if there's an error, we're going to fix it today, run all of the tests, do our acceptance testing, make sure that everything works in a test environment, and once it has passed all of the tests, it's going into production immediately. It is actually the future of software development or of information technology development. In order to do that, we need to figure out, before we know how the program is going to work, what kind of tests can we execute? We're going to identify test scenarios based on a user story, based on a requirement, based on a feature, or whatever else. The Agile philosophy says, in order for a developer to get to programming, the way it's going to work while they're in a scrum, they're going to be assigned a user story, and they're going to talk to the author of the user story and identify what exactly. Now let's make sure that we understand this. A user story is not a requirement. A user story is a trigger for a conversation. The developer and the end user, or the developer and the author of the user story, quite often the product owner, also by the way, quite often involving a business analyst, get together and discuss the story. And what they're trying to do is figure out what are the test scenarios that you're going to execute in order to make sure that I give you this story correctly, I as the developer. And we're going to capture those test scenarios. I'm going to run them in the application, make sure that they don't work, and then we're going to change the application until it passes all of your test scenarios. And at that point in time, you're going to have the application in a manner that has to be accepted. In order to do that, we need to figure out how to identify all of these test scenarios. First thing I would ask is, given a user story, again, user story, feature, requirement, anything, what is this application going to do in this scenario? If I understand what it's going to do, I have a basic understanding of its functionality. So the other question is, what can people do to it? How will I interact with it, or how will the end user interact with it ultimately? Or if I'm dealing with an embedded system, then how will other applications interact with it? A lot of things on the web are what are called APIs, which are application program interfaces. And ultimately, what I am going to try to figure out is what are the external factors that will influence this particular function that you're going to be creating. What are all of the factors that affect it? Not just what direct interaction, but anything that could affect it, such as database, time, any of those kind of things I'm going to be asking. And what does it do? What does it affect downstream? What are the output out of this? What are the things that it can affect? And how can I make sure that the input that the downstream applications or downstream systems need are going to be delivered correctly and accurately? How would I make sure that that business outcome is correct? Not just that it creates a business outcome, but it does it accurately, it does it precisely enough, it actually delivers what the end user needed. And the other thing to think about is the end user themselves. What are the weird and wacky things that they might do that could cause this application or this function that you're trying to create heartburn, that it would really cause it to fail or would cause it to deliver inaccurate results? Finally, the ultimate test of any user story or requirement at any level or feature is, will the business value that the user story stipulates be delivered?